All right, everyone. So, we are talking still about cabinet departments. Cabinet departments must be independently appointed. The president has to propose them. That means the White House has to like them, the president has to like them, and then they have to get through Congress, often controlled by the opposition, and therefore a very difficult thing to do. And this takes a lot of time. The appointment of a cabinet takes a while. The president has to find their staff, has to pick them out, has to vet them, has to interview them, and then the staff has to find out who they trust, who they like, and then the Senate has to confirm them and conduct their own investigations. This may take a year or more. What if something happens in that time, though? So 9/11 happened before Bush had all of his security personnel picked out. There's a risk of allowing government to go unstaffed for too long. Now, this feature, where presidents choose the heads of their bureaucracies, and then these individuals usually they leave after 3 years. They essentially retire and they go on to bigger and better things. This is really unique in the United States. It's even unique to the government. And private businesses don't work this way. That's to say, nobody appoints a CEO to a company and then the CEO just leaves after 3 years. In a parliamentary system, presidents or members of parliament become ministers. They are not independent experts. They are not people nominated by the prime minister. They are already members of parliament. But it seems to work, and bad things seem to happen when we mess with it. So, example, Bush gutted FEMA, and then FEMA was wholly unprepared for the Katrina disaster. But it can also go the other way. The Department of Veterans Affairs is very big, very large, and yet one of the most tragically inefficient bureaucracies in the world. So here's a chart. I don't want you to get overwhelmed by this chart. You don't need to know this chart. What I want you to see is this is what the average bureaucracy looks like. You have the head of the bureaucracy, then you have their deputy, sort of their vice president, and then you have different experts who advise these people and offices who advise these individuals. And then you have all these other people leading different subsections of the bureaucracy. This can be an enormous thing, but it works. Now, executive agencies, these are a bit more specific. So, for instance, Social Security Administration is an executive agency created by FDR. It is not represented on the cabinet. The EPA, likewise, is not represented on the presidential cabinet, but was in fact created by one Richard Nixon. What do they do? Well, sometimes they go to space, sometimes they volunteer in other countries, sometimes they gather information on other countries, like the CIA, or they manage the federal bank, the Federal Reserve. So, this is just a graph of NASA's leadership, and you can see the same characteristically complex organization going on. But again, it seems to work. We've been to space. Yay, space. These are a little different: independent executive agencies and regulatory commissions. So this starts in the 1800s, and the first regulatory commissions are created to address this problem of robber barons' control of state and federal agencies. You had private businesses starting to assume government offices. So new agencies were created to issue regulations, enforce laws, and settle disputes. These sort of acted, if you want to think about it this way, as a mini government. And what it represented was a back and forth between different federal agencies and industries. They needed expertise, so they must have experience on the private side too. But they also have to be quote unquote independent. That is, they cannot act on behalf of any private sector and they cannot be too beholden to any political sector. And you're beginning to see why this is problematic and it doesn't always work. Here are some examples. The Federal Trade Commission is one that comes up a lot. The Federal Maritime Commission doesn't come up as much. The Election Commission comes up quite a bit now. They evaluate the efficacy and the fairness of our elections. Final bureaucracy. We have government corporations and contractors. So these are corporations owned by the government or businesses which are hired by the government to carry out certain services. The post office is one example where the government owns this corporation. There is a CEO of the post office. And then there's also Amtrak, not owned by the government, but contracted by the government to provide sort of our modest equivalent of a national rail system. So who controls these bureaucracies, though? Is it us? Is it the people? I would say no. It's not us. Why? Because I have no idea what these people do. You probably have no idea what these people do. These agencies are too technical to understand. I certainly don't want to manage them. I can't imagine you do. So we need someone else. It's the whole reason we have bureaucracy. That's the whole reason delegative democracy is supposed to work. The president? Well, that's what the Constitution says. But it's been really difficult for the president to manage bureaucracy. Some bureaucracies are overwhelming. You think this chart looks complicated. I guarantee you, the president looks at this chart too, and they say, oh my gosh. The president is like you. They are an individual. Ideally, they're smart. Ideally, they have experience. Ideally, they know how to read these charts, but they are not perfect. So here's some quotes about this. Harry Truman was one of the last presidents, or the last president of World War II. He left office very unpopular, and the guy coming in to replace him was Dwight Eisenhower, a very popular general who led the D-Day attack. And he said, Eisenhower, he'll sit there and he'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen. Poor Ike, it won't be like a bit like the Army. He'll find it very frustrating. So presidents can't just snap their fingers and expect bureaucracies to get things done quickly. That's just not how they work. They have to deliberate. They have to evaluate policy. They have to offer the president advice. It is slow, and it can be overwhelming for one person. Nixon says, if we don't get rid of these people, they will sit back on their well-paid asses and wait for the next election to bring back their old bosses. And that was in reference to most of the bureaucrats in government at that time having been Democrats who had had a monopoly on government for 28 years. Now, does Congress control bureaucracies? They have some major powers over bureaucracies. Congress provides funding for bureaucracies, overseeing the federal budget. They also can oversee these bureaucracies. They have commissions to do this and committees to do this in Congress. And they can open investigations. They can authorize and reauthorize laws. They can also authorize the reorganization of these bureaucracies. Congress also has extensive oversight powers of the Department of Homeland Security, but then again, it appears that the Department of Homeland Security sometimes acts with a lot of autonomy. So then is it interest groups? Well, we'll come back to this next week. For now, y'all, stay rootin', stay tootin', by God, stay shootin', but most of all, just be good to each other.